Hi, this is Francine Lane and Thomas Wicks from Informa, and we are here to present a CTS overview and to finally answer all those questions that you have.
Thank you, Francine. The first question I have is, what is the difference between CTIS and the EU CTR?
Great question, Thomas. CTIS, or the Clinical Trial Information System, is the technology that enables the workings of the new EU clinical trial regulation, also known as the EU CTR. And it is the place where sponsors will go and enter their information, upload documents, and interact with the member states and regulatory authorities in the different member states to get their clinical trials authorized and to do other work on their clinical trials. They go hand in hand together, where you can't have one without the other. So once CTIS goes live, then the EU CTR becomes applicable.
And the CTIS is the replacement for the uterus CT system, where the EU CTR, the EU Clinical Trial Regulation, is the replacement for the directive that's been in place for a long time.
Yeah.
And just a side note, EU CTR is sometimes also the abbreviation used for the EU Clinical Trial Registry, which is the public front end of the uterus CT system. But in this case, we're talking about the regulation.
Yes, thanks, Thomas. Can you talk a little bit more about the implementation timeline for CTIS?
Sure, I think it might be helpful to look at that in a graphic. So just recently, the European Medicines Union, published a decision in the journal, on the official journal, and that decision essentially says that the audit of the clinical trial information system was successful. That allows the CTIS system to go live on January 31, 2022. And simultaneous with that go live of the system, the regulation, the EU Clinical Trial Regulation, also known as the Regulation EU number 536/2014, goes into application. The first 12 months after application, the use of the CTIS system is still voluntary for new trials that start in 2022. We would recommend that everyone pick at least one trial to run through the system before the end of that voluntary period, because then starting in 2023, it's mandatory, and it's quite a large change. 3 years after the application of the EU Clinical Trial Regulation, all trials that are currently still in the uterus CT system, if they are still ongoing and active, must be migrated to the new application. So that's in January of 2025. All ongoing trials must then be migrated and continue to be processed through the CTIS system. Sometime in the future, we're also looking at the implementation of phase 2 of policy 70, which will require the disclosure of individual patient data anonymized, but it's not clear when or how that's going to happen.
Can you explain a little bit about what the results disclosure requirements are for trials that end before the cutover to CTIS in January of 2025?
Sure. So if the system, if the results, if the study was registered through the uterus CT system, then results will be due on the uterus CT system the way they have been for years now in the same process. It's only studies that end after the cutover that must be migrated and then be processed through the CTIS system. Francine, maybe you could talk a little bit about this. Eventually, with the application of the EU CTR, plain language summaries for studies become required at the same time that results are disclosed in the CTIS system. But what about studies that stay on uterus CT and require results disclosure through uterus CT that are due after January 2022? So once the new regulation is in application, but before the cutover to the new system.
All right. This is an excellent question, and is actually a question that I've heard quite a lot through different industry discussion groups. And the end result is, if your trial is being conducted under the directive on uterus CT, then you follow the rules of the directive and or the requirements of the directive in uterus CT. And if your trial is being conducted in CTIS under the regulation, it follows those rules. So in this particular scenario, you have a study that's being run under the directive. It ends after January 2022, but before that final cutover date, you don't need to do a plain language summary for those studies. You still disclose your results as you would have done this year, for example, on uterus CT. So nothing changes for those studies that don't need to be migrated into CTIS or that do not start in CTIS.
Thank you, Francine. And I would just add from a trends perspective, nonetheless, sponsors are increasingly voluntarily disclosing or providing plain language summaries to provide information back to trial participants and the patient communities. But mandatory is for studies that are on CTIS.
So Thomas, can you explain a little bit about how the new EU clinical trials regulation and CTIS compare to the existing directive in uterus CT?
Sure, I think it might be useful to look at a table to see how to see the kind of the comparison. At its heart, the current system requires submission of clinical trial application and other communication with each competent authority separately. The new system is a central procedure. So that's really fundamentally the difference between the two applications. So the way it works today with uterus CT, you're submitting an application seeking approval from each country's regulatory authority or competent authority. In future, you do that just once for all member states, including the ethical and scientific evaluation. That's really useful because you can put in one application, and then if down the line you decide to add another country to the evaluation, you simply add another country in the CTIS system, and you don't have to create a whole package of information and submit that to those authorities. They have access to that workspace. Currently, you're also sending out packets of information to seek approval from each ethics committee. And again, in future, this is all done through that central procedure. It's all done with the shared documents that they can work through. Communication regarding the submission is specific to each country in the old system. So there's back and forth that are specific to each country. But in the future, rather than having communications from various sources, you will receive all your communication via the CTIS platform. Assessments traditionally and deadlines have varied a little bit from country to country and from different national competent authorities. For future applications run through the CTIS central procedure, there are timelines and deadlines that are applied across all countries and all member states. So that really streamlines the process a lot. The timing for responses for information might have varied across European member states in the uterus ET system and under the directive, but under the on CTIS and under the regulation, to avoid lapses of the application, you must reply to those RFI questions within 12 calendar days. So that's a tightening of the timelines and something that you should be prepared for. In the current system, you can amend protocols and add trial sites or countries at any time, independent of ongoing applications. In the new system, again, this is something that you're going to have to manage, because while certain applications are in process or certain reviews are ongoing, significant modifications sort of gets locked because it's prohibited from making updates to those while they're in review. So it's just a process thing that needs to be taken into consideration. Francine, am I missing anything that you can think of in terms of the differences there?
Yeah, I think one of the things to note is that holistically, the idea behind this regulation and CTIS is to streamline and make the process of authorizing and running your clinical trials in Europe to be better. So there's very strict timelines both on the sponsor side to respond and to update notifications, but there's also deadlines on the member state side to communicate back with the sponsor. So you'll get information about your approval for the trial, or if there's any questions about what you've submitted in a very tight timeline as well, which should help with your predictability and planning as well.
Thank you. So Francine, maybe you could talk a little bit about how often records need to be updated on CTIS.
Sure thing. This is a question near and dear to my heart. We do have a table of some of the updates on the next slide if you'd like to go there. As Thomas mentioned, there are definitely strict deadlines with communicating with member states within the CTIS application. And there are a couple of areas that are very strict that you need to know about. So the first one is that as your study is progressing through the various milestones after it's been authorized, those changes, those milestone dates, when they're met in each individual member state, need to be communicated to that member state within 15 days of when that happens. So there's a handful of milestones that need to be communicated everywhere from when your study starts in that member state to when the trial ends globally. Of course, if there's any temporary halts or unexpected events, those also get communicated through the CTIS system. This is a drastic change from the current process in uterus CT where only significant or substantial modifications needed to be communicated and updated in the system. One of the other areas is that this is even stricter timeline in many ways, is that if there are any urgent safety measures taken or any breaches, those need to be communicated to the member states within 7 days. So 7 days from when you become aware of a breach, you need to communicate that to the member state. And I think that goes to the highlighted question, Thomas, if you'll go forward to the big reveal. Are your systems, CROs, or sites, are they set up to collect this information in the timely manner that you need them to collect it in? It may be worth an audit, a review, some potential renegotiations of those agreements so that you meet the compliance deadlines of this new regulation. Thomas, anything?
Yeah, I would say in talking to a number of sponsors that these 15-day timelines are very challenging. Imagine you're running a trial in 7 different countries in Europe, and you need to know very quickly the first date that a study starts enrolling. And because you have to report that within 15 days of that study start. So that presupposes that the sites are reporting, the CROs are reporting, that you have enough time to review, to make sure that those dates are correct, and then before you then report that out. It's just an example, but also, having a really tight process around protocol amendments and all those kind of things, because it's tight. And to manage that at some point, you're really going to have to think about the systems that you're putting in place to manage that.
Mm-hmm. So there's a lot of questions that we've heard about phase 1 trials being made publicly available. Can you give us any additional information about that?
Yeah, so on the uterus CT system in the current application, phase 1 trials are publicly visible, but only if they have pediatric participants or part of a pediatric investigation plan. Phase 1 trials in adults only are not made publicly available currently. That changes. So phase 1 trials that are registered on the clinical trial information system will be made publicly available, just like other studies. There is an option to delay that a little bit. So rather than becoming publicly available within 6 or 12 months for results, for example, or just even the authorization itself, you can defer it up to 30 months for phase 1 trials, but only for phase 1 trials. Everything else must be disclosed on time. Francine, do you have anything to, other perspective on that?
Yeah, just something to add to it. This is a bit of a change because if you choose to defer, you must indicate that at the time you're making your application. This is typically or has traditionally been a decision that is not done during the authorization process. It happens towards the end of the process. So at clinicaltrials.gov, for example, you can choose to defer your results, but that decision is not due until after your study is completion or your primary completion date is met. A year after that, you need to let them know. This requires your regulatory groups or the groups that are submitting your applications for authorization need to know if you plan on deferring it way up front. And all indications are that once this decision is taken and submitted, it is not changeable. So whatever you submit and they agree to will be what happens at the end.
Yeah, that's a very good point. I think people really need to be careful about that. It's a similar timeline for deferrals of the disclosure of other documents. So the kind of protocol summary and result summary information that's made publicly on uterus CT currently, similarly will be made public on the CTIS system. There are additional documents that will be made public on CTIS that can also be deferred by 5 to 7 years. But again, all that deferral must be applied for at the beginning, at the very beginning of the application process, of the authorization process. Otherwise, that will not be allowed. So Francine, maybe you can talk about how someone might see the CTIS system before go live.
This is the question, the $1,000 question, I think that's on everybody's mind. We want to see it. What is it going to look like? What is it going to behave like? I have good news and bad news on that front. The good news is that they are intending to put in a sandbox later on in 2021 in Q4. The current dates are that in October, a sandbox should become available to the member states. In November, a sandbox should become available to participants of their master training program. And the date of opening up the sandbox to everyone else is not yet determined. It's TBD. They are very concerned that this is a very complicated system. And if people who are not well informed on how to use the system start accessing it, they might get a lot of support questions and need to respond to users when they're trying to get everything completed to go live. So I have a sneaking suspicion that might be pushed back even into maybe January. No information on that yet, but they do have some concerns about that. But if you are a part of an organization that has participated in the master training program, or maybe you know someone who is participating in it, you might be able to get access as early as November.
And I would also say that since the first 12 months, the CTIS system's use is voluntary to a degree, then that might still be a period where before you start using the system that you will have access to it to explore and understand.
So that actually leads into a great question. What can I do to prepare for using CTIS given what's available now?
And I think this is where there's a lot of very good training available. If you just Google or use a search engine of your choice, the term CTIS training, you will come to a site that looks like the one that we have here on the lower part of the slide deck. And it has a lot of information. There's training modules, handbooks, reference material. And there's a master training program that people are enrolled in now. So there will be certified trainers that you can bring in, consultants who might be able to help you with that and walk you through the processes of using the system, thinking through the SOPs, the checklists you may have to implement along the way. There's a lot of training information and events. They've done a really good job preparing everyone for it. Now, of course, that presupposes that people make use of those materials, but it's really well done. Francine, you and I have gone through all the available trainings and I'm impressed so far. Francine, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I would just say if there's one page that you want to bookmark to understand what's going on with CTIS, do this page, because this will give you links to everything that you need. And this is the page that they're updating. New trainings are added. You'll get to them from this page. As they host other training and webinars that are recorded, they'll be posted on this page. So it's a very good resource to send you out trawling into the other areas of the EMA website without needing to look at them directly. They're providing you with the links here.
Thank you.
All right, thanks.